Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Keysmash Studios tutorial on how to make a third-person shooter. Today we're going to be setting up the basic camera controller, and that's going to allow us to do a couple of really cool things that are going to be helpful when we make a third-person shooter. As always, if you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. It really does help us out, and we'll hop right into this. If you watched the last episode, we did a basic player controller, so when we come in here and hit play, we can move around, and we'll notice that the camera moves with the player, and that's because we have the main camera as a child of the player. Now, there are some cool things we can do if the main camera is not a child of the player, so we're going to go ahead and create a camera controller script to make that happen. So the first thing we're going to do is take our main camera and pull it off as a child. It's no longer a child of the player, it's just its own separate thing in the scene. Second thing we're going to do is create a camera controller C# script. I've gone ahead and made one, but it's totally empty, and we're going to make this together. First thing we want to do when we make it is we want to pull that camera controller script, and we're going to drag it right onto the main camera so that it is now attached to the main camera, and anytime the main camera is in the scene, which is all the time, that camera controller script will run. Now that we've done that, we're going to start about setting up this camera controller to do the exact same thing that we had it doing previously, which was following the character. And we can do that pretty simply. We just need a couple of things. The first being that we need to be able to know where the player is. So the first thing we're going to do before, just like last time, we're going to use some serialized fields to make a private, we're going to make a private variable able to be seen within the editor. So we're going to create a private game object, and that's going to be named player, obviously, because we want to find the player within the editor from this script, and we want to be able to look at that player and do things to that game object. So we've done that, and we also need something that we just need within the script, so I'm not going to serialize it. It's just going to be a private vector3, and that vector3 I'm just going to call offset. And that offset is just going to be how far away from the player is the camera. And we can, in 2 lines of code, really simply create a way that we can emulate what we did before with the camera attached to the player, and the camera always follows the player. And we want to do more things than that, but with those 2 lines of code, we can get back to where we were with the camera as a child of the player. So in order to do that, we need our start function. So we're going to do void start. And once we've done that, we're going to put just one quick thing in this void start. We need to know what the offset is. So presumably within the editor, which we have done, we've gone in here and we've placed the camera at an approximate third person over the shoulder type location for a camera relative to the player. And these 2 places, these 2 transforms, the camera and the player, have different places within the 3D grid zone of Unity. So we're just going to calculate what that 3D grid zone is within our code. And we can do that pretty simply just by saying the offset. So the offset difference between these is going to be equal to the transform of this script, so what it's attached to is the camera, so the transform of the camera, and then that's just going to be subtracted from the player dot transform dot position. So all we're doing is just finding the distance between these 2 things and saving it as an offset. The next thing that we're going to do is in something called late update. And late update happens after all the physics and all of the update functions are called. So typically we want to move our camera after all the physics is done and things of that nature. So we're just going to move the camera now to wherever the player is moving. So after the player moves, after the update moves on the player controller, then we're going to move the camera. Pretty easy for us to do. So to do this, we're just going to say transform dot position is equal to the player transform position. So that's just exactly where the player is, but we want to add that offset that we did. So we're going to say plus the distance between the camera and the player already, which is the offset. So if we were to just leave the entire camera controller script right there, save it, come over to Unity, and hit play, we would notice that this functions the exact same. Oop, I never targeted the player. Hang on. In our camera controller script, I'm just going to drag the player controller so it targets the player. This functions the exact same way that it had previously with the camera as a child of the player. So there are some things we can do to make this a little bit smoother, and we'll do that in our next episode. But I want to add a couple bits of functionality which you'll see pretty commonly in a third-person shooter that us removing the camera from the player is going to allow us to do. So we're going to edit our code just a little bit, and we're going to add some cool functions. So to do this, we're going to come back up here to our variables, and I usually separate my variables based on ones that are showing up within the editor and ones that are not, that are just within this code. So up here on the ones within the editor, we're going to do another serialized field because we have a private float right here to get. So we're going to get a float, and I'm going to call this side offset. Well, I should follow the naming convention. So I'm going to call this side offset, and this is going to be, typically in a third-person shooter, your character is not in the direct center of the screen. So we want to offset the camera slightly so that the character is not directly centered. But oftentimes games will have it so you can change the direction of the side offset. So if you want to have the player on the right or the player on the left, you can do that by pressing a certain key. So I want to say to this, oops, I don't want a summary. I want to say to this in a comment, I need a bool, so a true false, to determine which side. And we're going to create that bool in a second. Now down here on our things that we're just going to use within the script, we're going to create that bool. So we're going to create a private bool that is a toggle side offset. So that's going to be toggling which side is active, whether you're offset to the right or offset to the left. And I'm just going to say true is to the right, false is to the left. And that doesn't really matter. You can change this to be whichever way you want. It's just what I decided to do. Now that we've made that bool, we want to instantiate that bool within our start thing. So I'm going to set the default one, so the toggle side offset, I'm just going to set to true. Doesn't really matter. You can set it to false, you can set it to true. Just have it be one or the other within start. So we're going to do a couple things at once here, and it'll all make sense in a second. But we're going to add a couple more variables, and these are really going to help us out when we do this. So I want to add two things here. The first, I want to add a private vector3 as final offset, and I'll go over what all this is in just a second. We're just going to add them for right now. And I want to make another bool called private bool zoomed. And this is just going to be a toggle for when you're aiming down sights in a third-person shooter. You don't actually aim down sights, but oftentimes the camera will like zoom in just a little bit, and we're going to create that effect pretty easily. So we have a few variables to go over, and we're going to create two functions from this. So I'm going to go ahead and create those. The first being void zoom, and this is going to be our function here where we create the zoom effect. And further down, we are also going to do a void toggle side. And this is going to be the code where we execute the swapping of sides. So we've added a few things up here that we need to instantiate within Start, so we're going to go ahead and do that. The first thing I want to do is I want to set my final offset to be the exact same thing as offset initially. So when we initially start, our camera is in the exact same position. We just want to set that up. We also created this bool down here called zoomed, and by default we're not going to be zoomed in initially. So we're just going to say that zoomed, nope, not zoomed, zoomed, we are not zoomed, so that's false on default. So we've instantiated some things, but we haven't dealt with this side offset yet, and that's because I want to deal with it within the engine. So I'm going to hop back over to our engine here, and we can see that we now have this float position that we can do whichever way we want. So I'm going to go ahead and put this, at 1.5. And now that we've saved that in there, we don't actually need to instantiate it and Start, as long as it's always done within the engine. So we have this side offset, which is just a float up here, and we haven't done anything with that. So we need to offset the camera to one side or the other. And since I set the bool of which side is toggled initially, I need to make sure that that happens in the code at the start. So I initially said that we're toggled off to the right, since toggle side offset is true right here. True is to the right. So I need to edit our offset so that we are in the initial state that we said we were in when we said it was true. So to do that, we're going to take that final offset, and this is why we created this separate vector3. We're going to take that final offset, and we're just going to change just the X value of it. Because if we come back here into the editor, we can look at the camera and we can see that this red arrow is pointing to the right, and we want to offset to the right or to the left. And we can see up here that that is the X axis. So we are just changing the X axis on that. And once we do that, once we change that X axis, we'll be offset on that X axis. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're going to plus equal the side offset. And that's all we're going to do for that. But now that we've changed what our offset of the camera is, we actually need to change this just ever so slightly down here in late update. We're no longer doing the base offset, which is what is initially created in the engine. We're doing that plus our little side offset. So this needs to be changed from offset to final offset. So now if we come to our game and we hit play, we should see in our editor we're facing directly onto the character. But if we hit play, we'll notice that we're offset ever so slightly to the right, and we are now looking at a slightly different angle, much unlike we were when we're not playing and it's directly looking at the character. So that little side offset is something that we need to be able to change now. So we can go ahead and code that up. So we're going to come down here to toggle side, which is where we are going to enable the function to switch sides. So if we want to look over the right shoulder or we want to look over the left shoulder, we want to have a key where we can do that. So we're going to say if, and we're just going to grab an input here. So it doesn't really matter what this key is, we just need to get it. So whatever it is, get key down. So whatever key you choose, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to pick a key code. And for me, I'm just going to do H because that's just what I'm going to do. Doesn't matter at all what key you choose, just needs to be a key on the keyboard. So I'm going to say if in this, so when we press H, if we are toggled side offset is true. So I can just say if that boolean is true. So if we're true and we're on the right, then we're going to execute some code. Else we're going to execute some other code. So what do we want to do? So if it's true, the first thing we want to do when we press H to make it switch to the other side is to set it to false. So the first thing we want to do here is set it to false. And likewise, down here, if it's false, so if it's not true, we execute this code, we want to set it to true. So if we're on the right, we want to go to the left, and if we're on the left, we want to go to the right. But we need to set up the code to make that happen. And if we think about it, let me pull up Paint here to illustrate this. So if we think about it, right now we have the player right here, and we, the camera, are right here. We have this distance measured in our code. This is called the side offset. But we need to get that distance all the way over and then another distance to this side to be the exact same distance from the center. So this is actually 2 of the side offsets that we need to move across the character. So we're taking from the side offset to the right all the way across to the center, then all the way across to the left. Each time this code executes, we need to go from the right to the left, and then from the left to the right. So this happens twice, this side offset. So now that we've done that, we need to make sure that when we're swapping sides, we do it twice. So what we're going to do here is actually fairly simple. We're going to take our final offset. So this is what we're transforming the camera to be. So this is our current position of the camera in our game. And we're going to take, again, just the X value of that. We're going to take that, and we are going to, since we're on the right, we're going to subtract. So we're going to minus equals, and then here's the kicker. We got to do 2 times the side offset. So if we're on the right, we want to move left not once, but twice. And conversely, on the other side, we need to do the exact opposite. So if we're on the left, we want to move to the right. And the only way to do that is to add it instead of subtract it. So it's pretty simple, but now when we come up here and we go to our game, we should be able to come to our game, hit play, and we can see we're offset on the right now. We hit H. Oh, I did something dumb. We need to create our update and call this. So let's go ahead and create that void update now. So this is where we're functioning our toggle code. So I'm just going to call toggle side here and just make sure that we call it. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to call zoom, even though we haven't coded it yet. We will. So now that we've called the function, we'll go back here to Unity. And we'll see that we're offset to the right. When I hit H, we offset to the left. And the cool thing about having that serialized field on our camera controller script is if we don't really like it, we want to offset by 1.1 instead of 1.5. So we're just barely over the right shoulder. We can change that. So that's cool and all, but we need some way to aim down sights. And we've already created this function where this is going to happen, but now we need to make this happen. And typically in third-person shooters, when you right-click, you aim down sights. So let's try to make that happen. So let's grab the input. So if we right-click, so this is going to be if we do input.getMouse. This will help if I spell it right. .get mouse button down. So if we right click, we're going to toggle aim down sights. So, and we're just going to say that this is mouse button 1. If you don't know, in Unity, mouse button 0 is left click, mouse button 1 is right click, and mouse button 2 is like the scroll wheel click. I don't know any of the other ones off the top of my head, but those are the 3 that I know off the top of my head. So we're going to say, if we're here and we click this, we need to determine if we're zoomed in or not. So, well, you know, up here we made this bool that says zoomed. How about that? So we're going to say if we're zoomed in, we're going to execute some form of code to not zoom in. And if we're not, we're going to zoom in. So the first thing we want to do, just to make sure, so if we're zoomed in, our zoom is true. We want to set that equal to false. And likewise, if we're not zoomed in, we want zoomed to be set equal to true. When we zoom in on this camera controller, let's look at our camera control. I'm going to pull this off to the side just for a second. When we're looking at our camera controller, when we zoom in, what we want to have happen is we want to move down closer to the camera, to the player's shoulder. So right now, we'll open up Paint again just to illustrate this point. Right now, we have a player here and we have our camera up here. And we can look at this on a couple of planes. The first is that we are this distance in the Y and we are this distance in the Z plane. We know that X goes this way, but we don't really care about X in this case. We just want to be moving closer to the player. So what we want to do is when we hit this aim down sights, we want this camera to move in this direction. And the best way I can think about doing this is just to have the direction of the Y and have the direction of the Z. So in our code, we're moving our camera to here. We're not messing with the side-to-side angle. We're just messing with the up and then towards and away from the player. So in our code, we just need to mess with our offset, but only in offset Y and only in offset Z. So what we need to do when we're zooming in, so this is where we're not zoomed in and we want to zoom in, we're going to change our final offset, and we're just going to change the Y and Z separately. And we're not going to mess with the X, so we can still have that side-to-side toggle. So we're going to say the final offset of Y is equal to the offset of Y normally. So what its standard offset is, we're going to change that offset of Y divided by 2. And we're going to do the same thing, and we're just going to do it for Z. So the final offset of Z is going to be equal to the regular offset of Z divided by 2. So when we click the zoom, aim down sights button, we're just going to move the camera closer on the Y and the Z axis. And conversely, when we're not doing that, so when we are zoomed in and we want to zoom out, so we click the toggle again, we want to remove this ×2. We just want to set it back to the default offset that was initially created when we edited it within the editor. So now that we've done that, we make sure that our booleans are true and false, and we make sure that we have executed our code. We can go back and test it within the editor. So let's hit play. We can still do our side-to-side swap. And if we right-click, we can aim down sights. And we can still swap within our aim down sights because we're not editing the X variable by half. So this is a very standard character controller. It's the very bare minimum setup. Next week, we're going to mess with some stuff that makes it a little bit smoother when we're changing. It's not so jarring when we're swapping sides, and we're going to make it so when the character rotates and turns, we will follow. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let us know down below. Join our Discord if you would like any help with any of this. You'll find the link in the description below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. It really does help us out, and we'll see you next week.